thank you very much, Enrico, for the presentation. And now we are going to hear the presentation of Alessandro Metlica. He's the IP of this project, RISC, and is an associate professor of the comparative literature in Department of Linguistic and Literature Studies in Padova University. He passed some period in Louvain-la-Neuve University as Marie Curie, but also you have also other kind of contract there. And your research focus is related with the representation of power, in early modern period, and you have done two critical editions, one of Ferrante Pallavicino and another of Giobattista Casti. And okay, you analyze the ritualization of power in a pan-European scale, an analysis of the Pope space, Russia also, Habsburg monarchy, and France, and recently you published a book, La seduzione della pace, Giobattista Marino, le feste di corte nella Francia barocca. And recently you have prepared also, I have seen, together a monograph in Quaderni Veneti, is something related with that. And okay, in relation with, I think, Enrico has introduced, you are going to speak, if I know in a mistake, in the Venice case. Thanks. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this presentation, but not only. I would like to thank you, Manuel, and thanks to you all for the warm welcoming. It's really nice to be here. I'm very glad that this collaboration is being developed, and I look also further for other collaborations as well. But, well, today I'm here. I would like to reaffirm the general framework of our project, which Enrico just presented brilliantly. And I would like to do this by adding another element to this framework, which is chronology. Indeed, I think that Enrico's presentations offered a comprehensive overview of RISC's, the project, methodological ambitions, especially with regard to the shift that we envisage from intellectual to cultural history. And I would like to clarify our work method by illustrating in further details our corpus of sources, which is made for the most part, as has been shown, by literary and artistic representations. I worked in literary studies, but of course, if I'm here today, there is a reason, as I hope to show you. To achieve such goal, I moved to another political context. Actually, we already talked, it has already been mentioned, which is my main field of expertise right now, the Republic of Venice. Beside, I'm just talking of a single case study, which is the entry of the procurators of St. Mark. This ceremony, belonging to the field of Venetian civic ritual, played a key role not only in political, but also in cultural terms, for it involved performative gestures, ephemeral works of art, and encomiastic publications. In the past month, I worked on this case study extensively in order to submit a couple of papers for 2 Brill volumes, but since these books have not been published yet, at least the second, this is the first time that I actually present my results, and I count on your remarks and suggestions then to improve this contribution. Like this. Yes. So, well-renowned and much celebrated throughout Europe, Venetian political rituality has been copiously served by literature as well. The classic book by Edward Muir and the more recent monograph by Ian Fenlon, you see the 2 covers in my slide, stand out among many other contributions on the topic. However, the ceremony that I consider, the entry of the procurators of St. Mark, has been neglected almost completely so far. As I argue in my presentation, this is due precisely to the scholarly paradigm that Enrico has just discussed. By framing the Republican ritual in a supposedly unchanging tradition, which would have kept the same cultural references and performative etiquette in the name of a rather abstract concept of republicanism, scholars did not examine what happened in Venice after the pretended golden age of the Republic, covering the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Actually, most researchers seem to believe that such exam was simply unnecessary, because they assumed, given the consistency and the resilience of the Republican paradigm, that the social and political meanings associated to it cannot evolve nor be modified. Of course, this idea is not groundless per se, as a solid foundation in the sources instead, especially because the Serenissima itself created it and promoted it. I refer to what has been called the myth of Venice. Besides inspiring a sophisticated, multi-layered oligarchical government in which power was distributed between a multitude of short-time offices, in Venice, republicanism fed a system of symbols, or, in the words of Fallon, that I quoted before, an accumulation of inherited beliefs and meanings, which offered a self-portrait of the ruling elite, the Venetian patriciate. Values and ideas as diverse as faith, devotion, liberty, and constitutional balance merged in this myth, which could be seen, as James Grubb argues, as a mix of historical explanation and contingent propaganda. A city blessed by God and protected by St. Mark, whose body was brought in the lagoon in 828, Venice boasted of having enjoyed an undisputed liberty since its foundation, and this claim became even more distinctive in the 16th century in a Europe dominated by kingdoms and empires. Works like Gasparo Contarini's De Magistratibus Republica Venetorum, we already talked of this, and Donato Giannotti's La Repubblica dei Veneziani celebrated a unique constitution guaranteeing the perfect balance between monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. This myth famously led John Pocock, one of the most distinguished members of the so-called Cambridge School, to speak with regard to Contarini's model of a mechanization of virtue. In a state regulated so severely by accurate laws, ethics and politics seem to transform in a clockwork device. Oh, come on. I had a nice effort here, but it has been spoiled by the passage. Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. Of course, if where is Wally? Now I'm explaining it. No, don't worry. Civic ritual played a substantial part within the myth of Venice. The sovereignty of the Republic was staged through a series of highly codified performances according to a tight agenda that combined secular and liturgical events. Processions held on a religious occurrence, festivities celebrating a key historical date, receptions welcoming foreign guests, elections, popular games, and regattas helped to visualize the power of the state and Republican ideology. During the solemn parades that crossed St. Mark's Square, for example, the symbols of Venetian power and independence, the so-called trionfi dogali, were exhibited. Now we are coming to Wally. While accomplishing civic rituals, the presence of the Doge, the Prince of the Republic, as it was called, was fundamental. However, his figure, and this is clearly true, was not important per se. Indeed, Republican ritual did not pivot on the body of the Doge as French sacre did with the king's body. Of course, we all have read Kantorowicz sooner or later. The Doge rather personifies the body politic of the patriciate as a whole, and in this respect, Venetian civic ritual was not designed to celebrate a single ruler, but an oligarchical ruling class instead. This is the reason why, in the famous painting by Gentile Bellini that you have on the screen, as well and in many other teleri representing Venetian civic ritual, if you want to find the Doge, you have to play to Where is Wally? You see the little circle in white, the Doge is there. It's really hard, it's really difficult to see him if you don't know. So the same goes for very famous rituals like the Feast of the Ascension, the Sensa, when the Doge sailed to open sea and symbolically married the Adriatic Sea by dropping a golden ring into the water. Now, these rituals, including the role the Doge played in them, have been widely studied. So there's a ton of literature about that. But I think that a major issue arises when considering such literature. Scholars, once again, have focused almost exclusively on the centuries when the power of Venice was at its peak. Even if the Republic was fully independent until 1797, when it fell at the hands of Napoleon, no comprehensive analysis has been dedicated to Venetian civic ritual with regard to the 17th and the 18th century. Therefore, according to the most influential studies on the topic, in these 200 years, the patriciate would have simply preserved the tradition of the myth as if any major change made to it was unbearable. And this is really interesting for our working hypothesis, because as Enrico said, and I didn't know that you were saying this at the end of your presentation, but it's perfect. Of course, in the 17th century, the problem concerning monarchical representation is more present than ever. And so we have a lot of studies about 16th century when Venice is at the peak of its power, but we know very little about the relationship with the monarchical representation in the next 2 centuries, which are the most interesting time frame, in my opinion, to analyze such hybridization. You use this word, and I make it mine, as I often do with your ideas. I assume, on the contrary, that there was a metamorphosis in 17th century Venetian pageantry, and I argue that this new representation of power hinged on a new social basis. And this is the historical part, I think, of my presentation. Indeed, this shift in the representation of patriciate is primarily due to the power relationship within the state itself, which radically changed after the end of the Renaissance. The economic and political crisis affecting Venice in the 17th century, culminating in the Ottoman-Venetian wars of Candia and Morea, Crete and Peloponnese, made the contrast between rich and poor noblemen way deeper. Although nominally equal in rights and power, the two parties had increasingly different prerogatives, depending on the private fortune of their houses. The casate. This process within the patriciate affected the myth as well. According to the myth, the patriciate was an estate without internal contrasts, so that the decisions it took were highly coherent and almost mechanized. Starting in the 1630s, however, the most wealthy and powerful patricians openly challenged this vision, as they claimed a new protagonism both in politics and culture, from poetry to architecture. Several collections of eulogies were printed, glorifying this or that patrician with words and metaphors foreign to the Republican tradition. And churches arose with facades adorned by the portraits of the patrons in place of angels and saints. Sculptures portraying political leaders of the Serenissima, which were extremely rare before the 1620s, now appeared in squares, churches, and private palaces. And a good example, which had been studied by Matteo Casini, is one of the few contributions on this, are sea captains, because their military role obviously stood out during Candia and Morea wars. The ceremony of the entry of the procurators of St. Mark, so apparently a minor ceremony which has been neglected so far, mirrors with all evidence such process towards a new individualism within the Republican sphere. First of all, it should be noted that the appointment of a new procurator was one of the most significant political events in Venice, as top-ranked magistrates in charge of the church, treasury, and legacy of St. Mark's Basilica the Procuratore held the most prestigious office in the Republic after that of Doge. And just like the Doge, unlike all other Venetian offices, Procuratori were appointed for life. Most of the Doge themselves were selected among the procurators. The office had a long history, was created in the 11th century and had grown long since, both in number, from 2 to 9 members, and in power. For the Procuratore had accumulated more responsibilities throughout the 15th and the 16th century. Besides the upkeep of the Basilica and the Piazza area, where they were entitled to private accommodations in the Procuratie, procurators distributed alms, took care of orphans, executed wills, and administrated perpetual trusts made by private testators. Their financial duties granted the Procuratore a large influence over the Venetian economy and money markets, and even if the sway they exerted on politics was to some extent limited, they certainly were among the most powerful men of Venice. Now, I don't quote these sources from 17th and 18th century, but I want to say that as testified by these sources that you can see on the screen, the Procuratore played a major role within 17th century Venetian rituality as well. The most ritualized moment in their career was their election. The entry of a new member gave rise to various celebrations throughout the city. When the news of the election broke, bells rang for 3 days in celebration, drums and trumpets sounded in the streets, as the new elected handed out wine, bread, and money near the traghetti, the ferry stops. By night, churches and buildings were decorated with lamps, and there were fireworks in many parts of the city. After these 3 days rejoicings, the actual entry was scheduled. The ceremony could be held a few days as well as several months later, because procurators could be away from Venice as ambassadors, for example. The performance was at once physical and symbolic. The day the Procuratore officially started its office, he also received the keys to the new apartments on the piazza. Hence, his entry into service matched his entry to the Procuratie Palace. Although we have very few images of how the entry actually took place, in this respect, the painting by Gabriel Bella that you have on the screen is almost unique. Our printed sources describe the ceremony in details, and I'm sorry if I have to be very specific, but this is going to be important, as you will see. On the appointed day, friends and relatives picked up the newly elected procurator in front of his house and took him by boat at the Fondaco dei Tedeschi near the Rialto on the Grand Canal. Here, the group landed to reach the nearby church of San Salvador. A first solemn mass was celebrated, allowing the crowd to gather. Afterwards, the Procuratore left San Salvador in the middle of an imposing procession consisting of up to 500 or 600 people, and including servants and foreigners, musicians and soldiers, as well as the other procurators and a large part of the Senate. Bella's painting, which is set in front of San Salvador, portrays this very scene. Arranged in pairs, the cortege marched past the Mercerie, the streets where the most refined shops in Venice were, and paraded from the Rialto to St. Mark's Square. Another mass was celebrated in St. Mark's Basilica, and here there was another ritual. The procurator stepped to the altar, swore a personal oath, and finally received the keys to the office. In the end, people having marched with the newly elected procurator from San Salvador to San Mark either received 4 pani di zuccheri, they are some Venetian sweets, as a gift, or joined the banquet that ended the celebrations. I think that this has been studied only by an historian of art that I know, Paolo De Lorenzi, because indeed the artistic side of the ceremony was really important. Lavish decorations adorn the ceremonial route, which was transfigured by ephemeral arches and architectures adorned bearing the coat of arms of the Procuratore's family. The Campo of San Salvador, once again the same depicted by Bella, was filled with priceless tapestries, and the surrounding streets and alleys, as well as the Rialto Bridge, were peppered with festoons. Persian drapes hung from the windows, and several paintings, including allegorical compositions and portraits of the elected, were exhibited along the path taken by the processions. The shops on the mercerie played a main role too, because the owners put their most polished items on display. Gems, pearls, mirrors, rare feathers, and precious fabrics were arranged to compose the procurator's crest or his name. Sumptuous laceworks, decorated in gold and silver, were placed next to the engravings with his portrait, which many shops displayed in the window. These ephemeral decorations included even literature. Like the engraved portraits of the procurator, printed sheets with sonnets and other eulogies hung on the walls or were distributed among the crowd attending the entry. Storekeepers on the mercerie showcased such texts as if they were a rare merchandise. As far as our working hypothesis is concerned, and this is the part that this is the work I made because these texts were completely neglected before, the most interesting part of this literary production concerns a rather peculiar genre, the festival book. Indeed, on the occasion of the entry, texts were printed describing the ceremony, interpreting the allegories on display, and celebrating the virtues of both the procuratore and his casata. These festival books aimed at reflecting the ceremony, at representing the entry in the sense of presenting it again, and even in recreating it for the reader. In doing so, they intended first and foremost to honor the procurator, to whom the volume was, of course, dedicated. Therefore, by publishing these texts, authors pursued a form of individual celebration. Now, I finally come to the point I announced at the beginning, chronology. In fact, the most surprising data emerging from a study of these books is this. In the 35 years of the Morea War, that is between 1684 and 1718, this literary production was massive. A preliminary survey, far from being exhaustive, numbers among the works printed for the entry of a procuratore 21 texts. Festival books, but also books of poetry, orations, and panegyrics. Beside the accounts in the Gazette, we have dozens of these. The publication rate, you cannot see this, but please believe me, the publication rate is even higher in the 18th century, and we have more or less a book each year. But was this an actual tradition in the Republic of Venice? Was the entry of the procurators a codified part of the myth of the Serenissima? Printed sources tell a different story. Before the 1680s, books celebrating a single procurator were very, very rare. Just one book before 1650. Moreover, and this is the most interesting part I discovered by studying this text, the shift in terms of publications mirrors a surprising difference in ritual. Throughout the 16th century, and at least until the 1630s, the entry of the procurator of St. Mark was not only lacking a paper celebration in typography, but was also much more modest in itself. Not only had the performance less relevance, but even the route traveled by the procession was not the same. To follow the evolution of the ceremony, we can lean on the famous work by Francesco Sansovino, Venezia, città nobilissima e singolare. This sort of touristic guide avant la lettre, describing the most distinguished palaces, institutions, and festivities in Venice, was first published in 1581. Due to the large success of the book, however, a couple of up-to-date versions were published in the 17th century, adding to the original account subsequent events and new information. Thus, Sansovino's Venezia was reissued by Giovanni Stringa in 1604 and by Giustiniano Martignoni in 1663. So two up-to-date versions in the 17th century. The original version from 1581 is very frequently quoted as the main text on the rejoicings that followed the election of a procuratore. But Sansovino's account is not very detailed, especially because it does not mention the entry, but just the 3-day rejoicings that happened before it. And even the 3-day rejoicing seems to be a marginal issue compared to the historical origins and duties of the office. As evidence of this, Sansovino deals with the procurators in Book 7 on public palaces, rather than in Book 10 on city clothes, customs, and habits. Venetian ceremonies, such as the spectacular festivals organized to welcome foreign kings and princes, are described in Book 10, while the rejoicing for the procurators are quickly evoked in Book 7. We are discussing the procuratie, the palace on the piazza. We are not talking of the civic ritual. Apparently then, the entry of the procurator of St. Mark was not a crucial matter in 16th century Venice, as far as civic ritual was concerned. And testament to this are also some other pages that Sansovino devotes precisely in Book 10 to the festivities held after the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. Here we have the Rialto papered and covered with festoons. We have paintings hanging on the mercerie. We have the goods exhibited by the storekeepers, all elements that clearly point to the future ritual, but the entry of the procurators has nothing to do with this. It's a public rejoicing for the victory of Lepanto. It's not a private election of a single patrician. This does not mean that the ceremony of the entry did not exist in the 16th century. The reedition of Venezia, edited by Stringa, you see the second version from 1604, feels compelled to fill the gap by adding a description of the procession as it was performed already in Sansovino's times. However, the event looks quite different from the one reported in the later sources that I have already mentioned. Firstly, the order of magnitude is different. About 300 people, and not 500 or 600, attended the processions, and at the end, 2 and not 4 pani di zucchero were given. Secondly, and more importantly, the ceremonial route was not only sensibly shorter, but also radically dissimilar. For the parade started from the church of San Moisè instead of from San Salvador, and it did not include the mercerie. Google is saying that we have a 4 minutes walk against a 14 minutes walk. But I think that the mercerie are really the main point at stake here, because during the 16th century, the mercerie were already the most famous streets in Venice, and many cardinals and ambassadors explicitly asked the Venetian authorities to visit the shops, which were at the heart of European luxury market. Still, the street had a secondary role in the framework of civic ritual as far as the procurators of St. Mark are concerned, and it was used only for special occasions like after Lepanto. And as the route from Saint Mosè and Saint Mark is a straighter way to the Basilica with almost no shops on it, it can be assumed that at that time, in Sansovino's time, the profusion of ephemeral decorations and the exhibitions of luxurious goods weren't deemed mandatory to execute the ritual. Although most of the literature did not notice the change of route, this is clearly indicated in the third and last reedition of Venezia. Sorry, I changed a little bit too early. Martignoni adds a new paragraph explaining that senators and procurators, and here I translate a quote from the original text, do not gather anymore in the church of San Moisè, like Stringa said, but in the church of San Salvador. And this slide was simply to show you that we can assign a more accurate date to the substitution, which happened shortly after the plague of 1631. Indeed, the first document attesting that San Salvador was papered for the entry of procurator dates back to the election of Francesco Molin in 1634. And this new itinerary was quickly codified. In 1641, this was the route the procession took, and the first festival book, entirely devoted to the entry of a procuratore, appeared. 1641, the elected is Giovanni Pesaro, later Doge, the same to whom the dedication by Gualdo Priorato was directed, and the one really arguing that Venezia has to keep Candia, Crete, because it was a kingdom and Venice needed the royal authorities coming from the possession of Candia. I try to move to my conclusion, but I still have 5 minutes maybe?
Yeah.
Oh. The expansion of the ceremony, because it's not Enrico Zucchi, it's Andrea Zucchi. That's why you're laughing. The expansion of the ceremony of the entry in the central decades of the 16th century has very little to do with the image of the Venetian patriciate as a concordant and communal body politic. Instead, it seems to be connected with a new individualism, which target magnificence as means for a celebration of either self or family. The massive expenditure staged on the mercerie aimed to project the exceptional status of the few houses that could afford such spectacle. In this respect, it should be noted that in the period considered, a very rich man could also buy his access to the College of Procurators. While there were only 9 procuratori by merit, per merito, additional positions were on sale for 20,000 ducats. But the sale of the office was an exceptional measure taken to finance the state treasury. It has been taken very, very rarely in the 16th century, exclusively in troubled times, right before Lepanto, for example, and for few men. But the rising costs of the wars of Candia and Morea persuaded the Senate to adopt this measure on several occasions in the 17th century, and respectively 41 Candia and 24 Morea procurators by means per mezzi were elected. This measure echoed the one taken in 1646, which was even more radical. For the first time after 1297, the patriciate welcomed into its ranks some new families, as long as they could pay an enormous amount of money, 100,000 ducats. And it's clear that this policy, once again, which had its reasons in war, questioned the balance between economic and political power and gave rise to several tensions within the patriciate. As regards the entry of the procurators, such tensions emerged from the sumptuary laws promulgated by the competent authorities, the Provveditoria alle Pompe. In 1683, a petition was addressed to the Signoria denouncing the luxurious decorations of the mercerie as detrimental to the Republican values. A law in this regard was indeed voted and aimed at marking the entry of the procurators much more sober. The fleets of both escorting the elected to the fondaco, as well as the portraits hanging on the mercerie, were formally forbidden. The prohibition was reiterated 7 times between 1687 and 1692, but was actually ignored. The most lavish entries date precisely to these years, and they were organized in spite of all these sumptuary laws. And here I have just a few examples to conclude. This is not the right. Here we are. According to the festival book by Michelangelo Mariani, L'ingresso trionfale dell'illustre ed eccellentissimo signor Leonardo Donato, 4 huge portraits of Procurator Leonardo Donato were put on display during his entry in 1688. The first painting portraying the Procuratore on horseback hung in Campo San Bartolomeo at the beginning of the ceremonial route. The second was at the end of the Mercerie, on the back of St. Mark's clock tower. The third hung in the piazza, and the fourth, which was even bigger, stood over the entrance of the Procuratie. Even the purchase of the office could become a source of literary pride. At the title of a booklet printed in 1690 for Procurator Sebastiano Soranzo, L'oro divenuto più glorioso del merito, the gold made more glorious than the merit, confirms that 17th century wit did not flinch from such paradoxical topos. More generally, all these texts are hyperbolic, both in terms of quantity, there are many texts and they are often long-winded, and quality, for the pages constantly move towards figures of augmentation as anaphora and iteration. Authors increase their rhetorical devices, multiplying the metaphors and the classical exempla to reflect the luxury of the performance. My point is that after the end of the Renaissance, Venetian Republican imagery radically changed, mirroring an evolving society. Both the economic context and the political arena were quite different from the 16th century. Therefore, new rhetorical strategies proved to be necessary to support government decisions and to glorify those responsible for them. The new importance accorded to public luxury was one of the consequences. Civic ritual was clearly affected, and festival become even more lavish and spectacular. The entry of the Procurator of St. Mark is a remarkable example of this process, because the ritual was actually expanded. There is more, however, than a mere shift in scale. This transformation primarily concerned the ways in which the body politic of the Republic was represented. The myth of Venice depicted the patriciate as an estate regulated by clockwork mechanisms. All patricians were equal before the law, and only the Doge was considered a primus inter pares. While welcoming a foreign ruler or performing a ritual procession, the Doge did not act for himself, not for his house, but he rather embodied the whole patriciate, the Maggior Consiglio. For this reason, he was the only exception to the rule. However, things gradually changed after the 1630s, when several treatises spreading within the nobility, both prints and manuscripts, openly contested the myth. These texts criticized the wide-ranging influence exerted on Venetian politics by a few prominent casate, and countered the countless literary and artistic works extolling the members of these houses. The myth of Venice simply could not bear the new protagonism of the grandi, of the most wealthy and influential patricians. And here I have my last slide showing an example from the first festival book printed for this quite exceptional leader, Giovanni Pesaro, in 1641. Such luxury was not intended to celebrate the Republic, not the patriciate as a whole. A value that could not belong to the myth of Venice, splendor rather applies to the single procurator and to his house. A good example in literary terms of this rhetorical scheme, which breaks ties with 16th century Republican imagery, are the Apparati Veneti published by Domenico Vincenti. Before narrating the entry of Giovanni Pesaro, as well as the rejoicings that accompanied the main event, Vincenti outlines the procurator's career in what looks like a short political treatise. Indeed, as professed at the beginning of the book, the topic should be the virtuous relationship between Republican values and elective offices. For holding the office of procurator, per merito, of course, in the Serenissima, is the reward, and I quote from the original text, a life lived heroically, working hard for the common good. Here we are apparently in the field of Skinner's theory about the value of common good in celebrating Republican figures. According to the text, Pesaro does not owe his Sussex to a noble descent, but only to his merits. The Venetian institutions, working fairly and equally as usual, is the mechanization of virtue, have simply recognized Pesaro's merits. Indeed, however, Vincenti argues that Pesaro could have boasted about his blood, sangue, because his family is one of the most wealthy and powerful of Venice. But he did not. Now, this whole passage is a counterfactual conditional, built on a strong anaphora. Poteva, he could have, which is repeated 4 times. So the hypothesis to be discarded, that is to say, and I quote once again, Pesaro bragging about a family that has always been a site of magnificence, a school of religion, a remarkable scene of royal greatness, and a ever-shining glory of its republic. This hypothesis, which comes to name the royal greatness of Pesaro's family, is actually discussed in details and allows Vincenti to write a 4-page encomium of House Pesaro. Of course, even before the 17th century, the cult of the ancestors was a widespread phenomenon in Venice, and almost every palace had family portraits hanging in the portico, in the main room of the house. And in this respect, a text like this emphasizes a rather common approach. However, there is no denying that a sort of hero worship, unprecedented in the Republic iconography, raged in 17th century Venice. Public luxury, and the luxuries also in typography, as you can see, became a way of exhibiting private wealth and personal grandeur, and the celebration of the Republican office of procurator served as a pretext to celebrate the man who held it. This process actually reshaped the representation of the patriciate, and as the entry of the procurators of St. Mark witnesses, did reshape even the Republican ritual. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. Now we are going to have 10 minutes of pause, and after we back for the discussion, okay? Please at 6:10, okay? Thanks.